Hi everyone, I'm Penn from the creative Penn, and today I'm interviewing Carolyn Kaufman. Carolyn is a professor and doctor of clinical psychology, as well as the author of The Writer's Guide to Psychology. She also writes science fiction and fantasy and blogs at archetypewriting.com and querytracker.net. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show because I have a very personal interest in psychology, so thank you. So maybe you could start by telling us a bit more about your writing and your psychology background and why you wrote the book.
Okay. I started out, I started out writing when I was very young, but when I was in graduate school, I noticed that what I was seeing in the therapy room and in my classes was very different from what I was seeing like in movies and books and that kind of a thing. And so I got interested in it while I was in graduate school and actually did my dissertation on a related topic. But when I got into teaching, I sort of realized that my students also had a lot of misconceptions and that kind of a thing. So it became very natural to try to put the things together I like to do, teaching, writing, psychology, into a book. I had noticed when I looked that there was no guide manual for people who wanted to get the information accurate. You know, there are consultants out there, and they're not necessarily accessible to everybody. And so I wanted something that would be accessible and affordable and interesting for the average person who writes.
So what are some of the typical aspects that writers get wrong or that you've seen wrong in film and books and things?
I think that a lot of people assume that everybody uses what's called psychodynamic therapy, which is the assumption that everybody wants to know about your childhood and your unconscious, which is not necessarily the case. In fact, only a few types of therapists are really interested in that. There are some therapists that if you start talking about your childhood, they're actually going to go, wait a minute, let's focus on the present. Let's not distract from, where the issue really is, that kind of a thing. Obviously, most therapists don't make you lie down on the couch. In fact, most therapists would be freaked out if you lay down on the couch. I had people try that a couple times when I was doing therapy. I was like, no, sit up. It's okay. What else? Creating stereotypical therapists. There are actually 4 types of therapists that are stereotypes. Number 1 is Dr. Sexy, who's usually a female, right? So she's, looking slinky and hot at her client and, that kind of thing. And then there's Dr. Wonderful, who makes all the brilliant interpretations, gets everything right, knows exactly what to do. Usually Dr. Wonderful is actually the writer in disguise, who's trying to share information. There's Dr. Evil, who always has an evil plot of some kind to, he's going to do experiments or do electroshock therapy for no apparent reason, that kind of thing. Or Dr. Dippy, who's the one we make fun of. So he's just kind of like, can't get anything right, doesn't get it, he's just sort of an idiot. And so the character can go in and make the psychologist look bad and himself look good. And then one other one that I wanted to mention is not showing disorders accurately or consistently, which is a lot of times if a writer gives a character disorder, they will not show it consistently. So the character only has the disorder when it's convenient for the story.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Evil there, and I was just reminded when you were saying that. I mean, obviously, psychology and psychiatry now is, generally a humane and nice thing. But if we look back, not that many years, even 50 years ago, psychiatry particularly and psychology could be seen as quite evil itself. We look back at the Institute. Maybe you could just, talk a bit about that. And if people are writing more historical books, what they'll have to look for.
Okay. Some of the things that are dirty little secrets that we sort of, a lot of people try to sweep under the carpet are things like institutions used to be very overcrowded, and they used to do things like put people in straitjackets and leave them in those straitjackets for days at a time. And, if you imagine having somebody wrap you up that way for even an hour, it would be very painful. And so it was just, we didn't understand the mental illness well enough. We didn't understand what to do with it. And so it was sort of like just get people out of the way. So that happened a lot in the 1800s. In addition to that, there were lobotomies where they went in and actually destroyed the front of the brain, and they would either inject acid or scoop it out with basically a spoon. And it was really, really awful because what they would do is they would actually have the person be awake and they'd have them talk or sing or recite the Lord's Prayer or something like that. And when the person became incoherent, they'd be like, oh, you did too much. So really, really awful. And then the other thing that usually comes up is electroshock therapy, which is very, very humane now when it's done, at least in most westernized countries. But they used to do it in a way that was, they called it unmodified. And unmodified electroshock therapy was the shaking and people were scared and it could even break bones if people had strong enough convulsions.
I read quite a lot of Kay Redfield Jamison's books about creativity, suicide, and you know, she's brilliant. And one of her books is about kind of bipolar disorder, manic depression, and its relation to creativity. You know, maybe Van Gogh had it or whatever. Obviously, before they were diagnosable. What do you think about that? Do we have to have some awful mental disorder to become wonderfully creative?
I don't think that we do. And it's interesting because I, like you, have read a lot about that. I'm real interested in that connection between mental illness and creativity. And Redfield Jamison talks a lot about mood disorders, bipolar disorder in particular, like you said. I recently read a book that was really interesting and said that a lot of creative people are invested in the idea of writers being mentally ill. They kind of almost like the idea of us being a little eccentric and different. And so there are people who sort of believe that we are looking for it more than it's actually there. So, you know, everybody sort of has an opinion. I guess I'm of the opinion that, yes, I do think that there is a link. I think the research is strong enough to say that there is a link. What they find, though, when they actually start to treat people who have those disorders is that their creativity often improves rather than getting worse. So, you know, I have people that would come into therapy and say, well, I don't want you to mess up my creativity, you know, which I can relate to. And, you know, it's like, okay, well, we need to be very aware as we look at medications and things like that, because once in a while somebody will take a medication and it'll, like, numb them out, they'll say, or it'll interfere with their creativity, and it's like, well, then we need to move on to something else. And also to sort of keep it in mind as you do therapy, that kind of a thing. But overall, their creativity tends to improve if they get adequate treatment.
No.
But yes, I guess I should go back to the original question was, do we all have to be a little crazy? Well, we all have to be a little crazy to want to be writers, but do we all have to be mentally ill? No.
No, exactly. No, you know, I'm with you. It's just a fascinating area. And, you know, one that I guess will continue to be investigated as we learn more about the brain. Now, you have a chapter on the villain, you know, the evil guy, that, you know, we all apply certain psychological traits to that. Maybe you could just give us a bit of an overview of, you know, writing good villains and why people do what they do.
Okay. Well, I think there are a couple of stereotypes that we see a lot with villains. And so one is the real cold, slick villain who just, he's insane, he's brilliant, you know, and he does things that we don't understand. And a lot of times he's sort of almost a cardboard cutout character because everybody's familiar with it. The other one is the psychotic killer. And, you know, that one acts a little bit crazier, but is still on the same kind of path. I think that in a lot of cases, it's such a stereotype that we forget to actually create a villain who's interesting, and a villain who has a good motivation, and a villain who maybe even makes a little bit of sense. So I think I'm biased in thinking that villains, we should understand a little bit about what's going on with them, and maybe even be able to relate to them a little bit, because I think it makes them more interesting if we can appreciate where they're coming from. One of the things that's kind of interesting for writers is a lot of writers are uncomfortable delving into the mind of the villain because they're afraid that that means bad things about them. You know, oh, I can think of this. But I think that writers like Stephen King have proven that being able to do that can be very lucrative. So, you know, again, I think that just being able to sort of put yourself in the villain's shoes and try to appreciate really what is motivating him or her, why are they doing this, and then how can I help reader understand that?
People seem to be fascinated with these things on the fringes of well, there's even a TV show called Fringe, isn't there, which is about the edges of these things. What do you think about those aspects?
Well, first of all, I think it's hard not to be fascinated by those things. I know I went through a stage when I was younger when I was just obsessed with that stuff. You know, is it real? Is it not real? And I think that there's something in human beings that seeks the supernatural. In fact, I once saw something that said that every language in the world has a word for soul. And I thought, how fascinating that, you know, there are a lot of things that we don't have in common. I mean, some cultures don't even count past 10 or so, but we all have a word for soul. So there's this search for something supernatural. And then most cultures, if not all cultures, have some kind of higher power somewhere in their history. So we do seem to be on the search for the supernatural. And like I mentioned to you earlier, you know, they've identified an area of the brain that actually has religious feelings. So if they stimulate it with an electrode, people actually will start to have very religious feelings or sometimes religious experiences. And it's been interesting to me to hear the different arguments about that. Some people believe, well, that means obviously that there is a higher power, and the higher power has given us this part of the brain so that we can communicate with it. And other people are like, well, it's obvious that there is no higher power because it's just a brain defect or something like that.
Yeah, so no, I see what you mean. It could go either way, and I think people twist anything to their own beliefs, don't they? That's just human nature. But it's important, I think, to consider it, given that psychology is, you know, the science of mind and behavior. Faith is a key part of human behavior. It's in every culture. Yeah. So that's great. Now, I wanted to ask you about where psychology is going, because clearly there are so many things going on. You know, I'm thinking particularly of how neuroscience is changing things. What do you see in the next couple of years, I guess, as new things we're going to be looking at in psychology?
Right. One of the things that I'm really excited about and very interested in is some of these new treatments that are not chemical in nature. They're not medications. Obviously, as a former therapist, I always think therapy is important, but I think it's really neat that they're starting to work on things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, vagus nerve stimulation, and deep brain stimulation, and I should probably what those are. All three of them are treatments that do not involve any drugs. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is basically you sit back in a chair and they use a magnetic current to stimulate the left hemisphere of the brain, and it pushes neurotransmitters, which are the feel-good brain chemicals, into the brain. The other two, vagus nerve stimulation and deep brain stimulation, are that electrodes are implanted in the body. There's a battery that's placed under the collarbone, and then electrodes that either go up into the neck or into the brain, and that basically get rid of problems like depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, that kind of a thing. And some people think it's really scary because they're like, somebody's going to implant an electrode in my brain, you know? But I think for people who have treatment-resistant depressions or treatment-resistant obsessive compulsive disorder or something like that, they say, like, with deep brain stimulation, that when they implant the electrode, the symptoms just vanish. And I think, what a neat thing, you know, and how nice it would be to go without side effects and not have to worry about that kind of a thing. And they're very expensive treatments and they're still very experimental, but I think they're promising.
Where can people find your book, The Writer's Guide to Psychology?
Probably the best place to find it is online. Amazon.com is a great place to find it. Here in the U.S., they've got it for $10, which is a really good price, $5 less than the cover price. I know that it's also available at like Indigo in Canada, which is an online reseller, and places like Barnes and Noble and Borders online. So I also have a website called Writer's Guide to Psychology.com, and there are links there too.
Well, thanks ever so much for your time, Carolyn. That was great.
Thank you.